Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to be here and just to have had such a stimulating 2 days with everybody. I am trained as an analytic philosopher, and so that is very much the methodology that I'll be using. Okay, so big picture question. How do I? There we go. Okay, so what are the interpersonal infrastructures that enable us to transmit knowledge in face-to-face conversations? And I'm going to argue that in a robust class of cases, we rely on rituals and practices in which we transmit non-knowledge, and I'm going to try to make this precise, but it's almost as if we're simulating the transmission of knowledge at one level of the interaction. But simultaneously, there's something like a higher level of the interaction. And at that level of the interaction, we are transmitting knowledge. And it's precisely the transmission of the non-knowledge that enables the transmission of the knowledge. That's the view from 60,000 feet. All right, so I'm going to start by telling you about the standard model within analytic philosophy of language and formal linguistic pragmatics. So there's been a tremendous amount of work. It started out as theoretical work, but has since become empirically informed about the structure of discourse. And coming out of the work of Paul Grice, who was writing in the 60s and 70s, first at Oxford and then at the University of California, Berkeley, and then empirically and technically developed in the work of my colleague at MIT, Bob Stonacker. So according to this line of thought, the primary aim or purpose of conversation is to pool our knowledge. Now, this sounds obviously and ridiculously, maybe even outrageously overly simplistic. So what's quite impressive is the extent of the achievements that have been made in formal pragmatic linguistics under such an extremely idealized assumption. Okay, so here's the kind of conversation that philosophers of language like to study. So Larry asks his friend George, who do you think killed the butler? George says, I saw the gardener looking suspicious earlier in the day. It can't have been him. He has an alibi. But his wife was the one who vouched for him, and I don't trust her. Okay, what makes this conversation very nice, paradigmatic, well-behaved for the purposes of the kinds of pragmatics I do are the following features. One, they have a very clearly defined goal, and the goal is epistemic, so they're aiming to solve a theoretical question, namely, they want to determine who killed the butler. And to do that, they're pooling their knowledge, so they're taking turns, proposing an update to a shared body of information. And that body of information is often called the common ground or context. Now, there's a technical assumption that in the standard case, this shared body of information is common or joint knowledge. And what is that? Well, it's an infinitely iterated shared knowledge. So I have it with someone else if we both know P and know that we know P and know that we know that we know P ad infinitum. This is just supposed to model knowledge that's public or intersubjective in a special sense. So if George and Larry both happen to know that the gardener was looking suspicious earlier in the day, but George doesn't know that Larry knows that, that information is not yet common ground. It's not yet part of the shared intersubjective context. And that's why George asserts it. George is putting that information into this shared pool or reservoir of knowledge that then becomes a resource for them that they can take as background for the remainder of the interaction. All right, so as I've said, I'm not going to go through the details because I think they're kind of boring, but this model has had a great deal of success in predicting certain empirical linguistic phenomena, both on the sentence level and at the discourse structure level. It's been studied cross-linguistically as well. We also have formal tools to easily and precisely model incremental updates to a shared information state. Again, I'm abstracting from the technical details. They don't really matter for the purposes of our inquiry in this talk. But if you're interested, the lingua franca is possible world semantics, where information is treated as a kind of unstructured chunk. And as you get more, you start with a giant sphere of possibilities, as it were, and as you learn more, you cut out possibilities from that shared space until you get down to the actual world. But again, this is a technical implementation of the idea, the theoretical idea that what we're doing is pooling knowledge. Okay, but as I've said, the problem is that this model seems to make outrageously simplistic idealization. So the question is, how should we interpret this model, and to what extent can we extend this to study non-standard kinds of conversation? Or in the best of case, to what extent can this simple model actually provide some kind of insight or guide our inquiry into other forms of discourse? Okay, so here's a standard way of expanding the model. And now this is still not my work, this is all still background. So instead of thinking about what we're doing as pooling information, think about what we're doing as updating a shared information state that may or may not correspond to our shared knowledge. So we're going to become flexible about what the shared information state really is. And also we're going to let into our theorizing, or we're going to drop the assumption that the only reason we're pooling information is for its own sake, to answer a single theoretical question. There might be some further practical purpose, such as making a decision or negotiating a relationship, for which we are pooling our knowledge. Okay, so let's start with the first expansion. So here is just a normal little piece of small talk between two colleagues. How was your summer? I just got back from San Diego. Oh, cool. How was that? Awesome. I got to hang out with my cousins who I don't normally see. What about you? Were you in Boston all summer? Okay, now in a sense, they're certainly pooling information, or we can assume that they're pooling knowledge, that they're both saying what they know, and in virtue of what they say, it becomes joint knowledge. But unlike George and Larry, their ultimate goal here is not a theoretical goal of settling an epistemic question, it's ultimately a social goal. So the reason they're pooling their knowledge about their summer experiences is primarily to maintain their relationship. So far, we don't have a big change to the standard picture. Okay, slightly bigger change. So here's what Stalnaker, this is a very famous passage in Pragmatics about expanding the standard model. This is all the way back from 1974. When I talk to my barber, neither of us expects to learn anything. We are talking just to be civil and to pass the time. If we haven't much to say, we may act as if the background of common knowledge is smaller than it really is. Cold weather today, isn't it? Sure is, windy too. Well, spring will be here before long. Maybe this is how they talked in the 70s. Although there is little communication going on here, it is clear that what is going on is to be understood in terms of genuine communication. We are pretending to communicate, and here by this, we are pretending to pool knowledge. And our pretense can be explained in terms of the same categories as a serious exchange of information. Okay, so what makes this a pretense of the pooling of knowledge is not that what they're saying isn't known, it's that it is already held in joint knowledge. And so if you thought the aim was just to pool our knowledge, this discourse would be irrational, it would be defective, because they're not adding to their store. Rather, they're pretending to add to their store of common knowledge. That's the proposal. All right, so here's how this idea of making the state of information flexible in terms of what attitudes it models, here's how it works. So Melanie says, I just submitted my manuscript to Fancy Philosophy Journal.
Justin says, I actually have a colleague named Justin. So he says, I hope it gets in. I think it's a great article. So after Justin speaks, it's common ground that Justin hopes that FPJ accepts Melanie's article. And since this was a non-defective assertion, according to the model, or the way we're sort of thinking about the model, it would not have been common ground before he asserted it. So what he's doing is adding this information to the context. But Justin could be lying. So he aims to deceive Melanie. He wants Melanie to think that he thinks she's smart, that he thinks she's a big old dummy and the article sucks. So in that case, we'd say Justin is purporting to know that he thinks the article is great. He could be asserting something that they already jointly know. So this could be a kind of redundant pooling of information like we saw in the weather case. Okay, getting slightly more interesting. It could be a polite pretense. So he might intend for Melanie not to know whether he in fact likes the article, and he intends for her to recognize that he intends this. So the kind of non-informative nature of this assertion is supposed to be out in the open. He wants her to take something else away from this. And then, of course, the variation on this case would be one in which Justin and Melanie jointly know that Justin doesn't like the article and doesn't want to get it in because they're bitter rivals and they hate each other's guts, but they're just polite to each other in person to keep the peace. Now, all of these can be described as identical conversations in one sense, namely in the sense of updating this context. Okay, so here's where we are. We exchange knowledge or simulate a simple exchange of knowledge sometimes, primarily in order to advance other social goals, especially relationship maintenance and negotiation. The standard model has no problem allowing us to state that. This isn't incompatible with anything in the standard model. Okay, the question though is why? And in particular, why would it be that we exchange knowledge or simulate the exchange of knowledge in order to accomplish these social goals? What makes this a rational plan? What explains the kind of behavior we see? Why is conversation a good way to maintain relationships or to negotiate these relationships? And again, these are supposed to be conversations, not directly about the relationship. Otherwise, it would be obvious. Okay, so let me tell you more about the puzzle, or why I think this is genuinely a hard question. So you might think this is just an obvious answer, right? We do all sorts of things in the social world, primarily just to conform to social norms, to be a good social actor, or in order to express respect and other pro-social attitudes towards each other, or both. Or because we are habituated into doing so, because we have taught that that's the morally correct thing to do. Just think about all of the reasons why you might shake somebody's hand. So I think this might be true. There might genuinely be a practice or a convention of pooling knowledge or simulating the pooling of knowledge in order to advance relationship goals or advance social goals. But just comparing small talk and similar kinds of conversations to a handshake doesn't seem to get us the explanatory purchase that we want. Ideally, we'd like to know something a little bit more about how the structure of the practice, the pooling of knowledge, the talking, relates to its function. Especially because it seems like talking for a long time to somebody is a very inefficient way of expressing respect, especially since you could just shake their hand, bow to them, or say, I respect you. Why do we have this elaborate social ritual? Here's another hypothesis. Think of conversation like a gift exchange. So we exchange useful commodities in order to intermesh our interests and to show goodwill for each other. There's a long, very rich anthropological tradition on the function of gift exchanges in promoting social cohesion. Okay, this is getting a little bit more specific. There's some kind of relation between the function of the practice and its structure. And I think this is a pretty good explanation of, for example, gossip patterns when people get together and exchange gossip, especially if it's risky gossip. So they're both taking on social liability when they tell each other, oh, I just heard this juicy rumor, and oh yeah, this like thing I shouldn't tell you about just happened, but I'm going to tell you anyway, right? It's a kind of mutual pact. It's a pact of mutual social destruction. That's overstating it, but we're both taking on social risk and building intimacy in that way. All right, but I don't think this is going to cover all of the small talk cases. So we needn't actually exchange useful knowledge in small talk. I don't really have any use to make of your story about what you did in Bermuda, unless it's very funny, but often it's not even very funny, and yet it's doing something. That's why I'm listening to it. Moreover, often, as we've just seen, we're not even exchanging knowledge. We're literally just saying things in a kind of ping-pongy fashion that we already know. So what is going on? Can we say something a little bit better than this? And I think so. I think actually we are indirectly, informatively communicating and pooling our knowledge in that sense, but the mechanism by which we're doing so is quite different than the mechanism that we use in a standard simple kind of conversation, like the one that Larry and George had. So this is an insight that I'm extracting from the work of a mid-century sociologist, Irving Goffman, who was an interactional sociologist. He is kind of was taken up by some corners of sociolinguistics in the 70s and 80s. He has had almost no uptake in analytic philosophy of language, which I think is a shame because I think he has precisely the theoretical tools that my field needs to make progress. Okay, so to elaborate this idea, I want to start with a very simple case. Suppose I say, I'm from Massachusetts. What did you learn? Well, I just told you that I'm from Massachusetts. So you learned something in virtue of the fact that I asserted it, and what you learned is identical to the content of my assertion. But if this was the first time you've ever heard me speak, you also learned something else. I exercised my capacity to speak English, and I thereby showed you and provided you evidence that I can speak English. Now, that might not be very interesting information, especially if you already knew that I spoke English. Just receiving more confirmatory evidence of this fact is not going to do much practical work for you. So here is another case that I assure you is completely fictional because I really don't understand what I'm about to imagine myself telling you about. So suppose at dinner last night, I talked for a long time in a quite intelligent but maybe pompous fashion about the development of Romanian conceptual art. So what was I doing and what did you learn about me? Well, I was telling you about Romanian conceptual art, but I was also, again, I was exercising an underlying capacity or skill, if I wasn't just bullshitting, but presuming I wasn't, I was exercising my capacity to speak fluently about Romanian conceptual art in order to thereby show you that I'm a sophisticated or educated person. Now, in both cases, I'm providing you with information by speaking or in virtue of what I'm saying. But the kind of evidence is very different. So in the first kind of case, this is what philosophers would call testimonial evidence. I'm testifying about Romanian conceptual art, and I'm thereby on the hook morally for what I say in a special way. You could accuse me of lying. In the second kind of case, it's more akin to wearing an expensive jacket to signal my wealth. Again, what's sort of unusual is that I'm accomplishing this signal via the very same utterance by which I'm providing you with testimonial evidence. Okay, so Goffman argued that many of our social practices are structured so that when we conform to them, we exercise and so provide each other evidence of some socially important underlying capacities, skills, or dispositions. It's not that every time we conform to a social norm, we thereby have the intention to provide this evidence. Nonetheless, there's a communicative function that's conditioning and explaining the structure of many of our practices. And I think the same holds true of these so-called non-standard conversations. They have a similar indirect communicative function. So conversation enables us to demonstrate and so provide evidence of our willingness and our ability to conform to basic social norms. But of course, if I conform to any social norm, I'm providing you with that evidence, even if it's just combing my hair in the morning. So conversation also enables us to demonstrate and provide evidence of more specific capabilities, such as our ability and willingness to pay attention to each other, to focus our attention in a sustained way on a single project. To exercise good judgment and picking and sticking with an appropriate topic of conversation. Given the complexity of norms about what we can and can't bring up in a conversation, this is actually requires quite a bit of finesse. Okay, to coordinate in a shared temporally extended project. Conversation requires an enmeshing of rational plans at a very high pace and rate. If I can converse with you, I can probably, I don't know, go hiking with you, unless I can't hike. But I'm capable of coordinating with you in a basic sense. And then, of course, we have more specific capabilities I can show, such as my cleverness, my sense of humor, specialized domains of knowledge about, for example, conceptual art, or my personality. Now, that's true of all conversations, but I think a special class of conversations can be demarcated by the following feature. In a ritual conversation, we pool or simulate the pooling of our knowledge primarily in order to exercise and so provide evidence of socially important features of our practical agency. So we could actually genuinely be telling each other information about the world. We could genuinely be pooling our knowledge. And we could be pooling our knowledge via updating a shared context, via a sequence of assertions. But the communicative project that primarily interests us might not be the project where it might not be the project of acquiring information via identifying the content of someone's assertion. The precise way to put this is actually a little bit difficult, again, because we're accomplishing two things with these speech acts. But the thing that we care about is the secondary evidence of what we demonstrate through these primary speech acts. Now, it's not just small talk that I think is ritualistic in this sense. I think banter with friends is often a form of ritual conversation. What we're interested in communicating to each other is how well we know each other. We know exactly how offensive we can get away with being without breaking the relationship, or we know exactly how randomly we can steer the conversation from this topic to that topic while managing to maintain a shared focus of attention. These are all ways of demonstrating our skill of reading the other person and so providing evidence of the underlying features that enable us to maintain our intimacy. We're literally showing each other how intimate we are. Another interesting case is picking a fight. So a case in which two people seem to be fighting about some first order issue, like does the financial policy of the department allow us to purchase alcohol with the department credit card. In a lot of American universities, you can't. So two people could be having a bitter fight where what's primarily at issue, the reason they're having this fight is because they actually care about what the policy says. But in an interesting class of subcases, really what they're interested in is, for example, showing off about who has the better ability to twist and turn the policies for their own practical end. Or they're having a kind of contest of wills. They're seeing who is going to dominate in the conversation with their preferred interpretation. And it's that contest of wills, their demonstration of their underlying willpower or social interpersonal skill, that is the primary motivation. And that is structuring the first order conversation that looks, if you just look at their assertions, like it's about a matter of policy. Now, one of the interesting features of ritual conversation is that because of the mechanism by which we are exchanging knowledge, which is not testimonial, the evidence is in some ways better. So it's fairly easy to lie, especially if I'm lying about features of myself that are not easy to check up on. So I could just stand here and tell you that I have a great deal of willpower, or that I have a great deal of expertise in the metaphysics of objects. That last one certainly is not true. It's much harder to fake having a capacity, or to fake showing that you have a capacity. It's of course possible, but it's especially if the other person, for example, doesn't know very much about the capacity you're showing them, like when you pretend to speak really good French because you know the other person has no idea what you're saying and will be very impressed by something vaguely French sounding. But generally, it's harder to get away with deception. And so, especially if you're in an environment where you want to quickly establish trust or quickly establish that you're a good interactional partner, it can be better to convey certain kinds of information via ritual display. Okay, last section. I think we're still not done though. So there's a kind of stickiness to what we do within conversations, even when we jointly know that what we're doing within that conversation is a kind of pretense or performance. We're pretending to pool knowledge, but we know we're not really doing that. But we can't make that fact explicit. Now notice that this doesn't pattern with other kinds of joint activities. So we might cook together or play poker or strategize about a work project in part or entirely in order to maintain our relationships. And it's totally fine to say something like this. It would be like very earnest of you and very emotional, but it's not fundamentally insulting. You could say, I really enjoyed cooking with you. I learned a lot about your personality that way. I'm glad we did that to bond. Okay, it would be completely socially unacceptable to say the following: I really enjoyed mutually pretending that you were super interested in my new window panes. Thanks for giving me that experience. I learned a lot about your personality that way. Again, this is actually jointly known, but you can't make it explicit. Similarly, if we're engaged in a bit of improv, so I'm doing a bit with someone about how Americans all have guns, I can momentarily make speech acts that move outside of the pretense so long as it doesn't interfere with some other practical project. So as long as I'm not being a killjoy or I'm not ruining things for some audience. So I could say, hey, check out my Glock. Wait, that's a kind of gun, right? I just want to make sure I'm doing this right. But we can't do the same thing with the properly social pretense, again, even if the information is jointly known. So if my colleague says to me, oh, you just gave a really good paper, the following information could be jointly understood to be true, but it would be viciously aggressive for me to say the following: thanks for saying that it's a good paper. I mean, I know that you're just trying to convey that you want to be good colleagues and you really don't know or understand anything about what I'm doing. And I suspect if you did, you would actually hate it, but I really appreciate the underlying sentiment. That's like something out of a comedy movie, or what I would say if I actually hated my colleague and wanted to drop a social nuclear bomb on the relationship. All right, so this is kind of surprising. It's such a basic feature of our interaction that we don't notice it. But for all I've said, I have no story about why this is. So nothing about the proposed communicative function of ritualistic conversations explains this striking structural property. Again, the information is available. We already jointly know it. At worst, it should be redundant. And if the reason that we're going through this pretense is to just demonstrate certain underlying properties, I'm still accomplishing that, even if I make explicit what we're doing. Okay, to explain this, I think we need another Goffmanian insight. So Goffman argued that we all implicitly, so not just as a theorist, but as a matter of our actual practical interactions, distinguish between actual selves, the agent who acts and who bears moral responsibility for those actions, and our virtual or interactional selves. So our interactional self is our face. And I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through this a little bit fast, but please feel free to ask questions. So Goffman defined face in this paper. It was first published in 1955. Face is an image of the self delineated in terms of approved social attributes. A person may be said to have or be in or maintain face when the way he behaves in context presents an image of him that is internally consistent, that is supported by judgments and evidence conveyed by other participants, and that is confirmed by evidence conveyed through impersonal agencies in the situation. That's like TV screens, or like it would, if there was an embarrassing photo of me right here, I would not be in face. That's the impersonal agency. All right, so the person's face is something that lives diffusely in the flow of the events of the encounter. It's constituted by what we do when interacting. It's not a persona, style, or social position, so it's a role that we enact and perform within the interaction itself. And strikingly, again, we can jointly know that who we are is inconsistent with the face that we're projecting, and that joint knowledge does not necessarily damage our face. So faces tend to be a little bit more consistent, more idealized, and simpler than we know ourselves to be. So here's an example of what I have in mind. So suppose you're a senior professor, and it's part of your face when you interact with your students that you always have to be the smartest one and get the last word in on everything. But it's jointly known in your research group that one of your students actually is immensely more talented than you are and often makes great points. The entire group can coordinate around this information about Katie and yet still maintain the professor's face. So Katie, for example, when she makes her point, might say, well, of course, professor, you have previously told me that, blah, 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 and then something Katie made up, or something that's from Katie. They can all agree this was what Professor Smith said, all completely understand what they're doing, and nonetheless, this is not face damaging to the professor. All right, so I think the stickiness of what we do in conversations is a structural feature of face. So our face, when we have these two planes or information bodies in a conversation, the primary one, the one that's most vivid and direct, directly visible because it's what our assertions update, that is what our face, that is what determines our face. Our face is determined by what that body of information entails about us. So in a real conversation, as opposed to a conversation in which we're merely improvising, what we directly express has the capacity to alter our faces, even when it's jointly known to be false. All right, so the reason that this is so offensive is because when I say this, I'm directly attacking my interlocutor's face. My interlocutor has adopted the face of someone who thinks my face is good. We jointly know that that face does not necessarily correspond to reality. When I make that explicit, however, I am preventing him from acquiring the face, because face has to be mutually ratified. It's determined by shared information. Okay, so I think there's a second thing we do in ritual conversation. So in addition to displaying features of our practical agency, we also construct and provide evidence of the kind of face that we are willing and able to maintain in an interaction. So in the small talk case, Melanie and Justin are showing that they can construct and maintain certain faces as good colleagues, as liking each other. And that's going to provide information for how they interact going forward. Quick prediction. So this would predict that the more we're merely simulating the pooling of knowledge, the better evidence we can provide about our willingness and ability to ratify someone's face just in virtue of the fact that it's the face they want. Because in this kind of conversation, it's understood that there's a gap between my face, and what I really am. And I think that correctly predicts why so much relationship maintenance talks in low trust relationships or low trust environments, such as just getting to know somebody or kind of stodgy, cold workplaces, involves the mere and obvious simulation of good regard, trust, and mutual interest that doesn't yet exist. We are showing that we are willing to grant each other very positive faces, and we are doing it under conditions where we are providing evidence that we are willing to grant that face even if we don't believe it, just because that's the kind of face someone else wants. Right, so back to the big picture. What are the interpersonal infrastructures that enable us to transmit knowledge in a face-to-face conversation? So we use ritual conversations in order to provide each other with evidence about the kind of underlying agent we actually are, and about the kind of virtual interactional identity that we want and intend to maintain. So we're providing our interlocutor with two kinds of evidence. Evidence about two aspects of us, the actual and the interactional. And we are doing it through this indirect mechanism of showing what we can do. So there's no simple dichotomy between communicative, informational, simple conversations on the one hand, and social, ritualistic, or performative conversations on the other hand. The latter group still involve communication in the sense of providing each other with evidence about the way the world is. All right, thank you very much.